October 2000, the last big flood at Verbano, or Lake Maggiore. An exceptional flood. The level of the lake exceeds 197.5 meters. The autumn rains over the days before had swollen streams and rivers, and they emptied themselves menacingly into the lake. Millions of cubic meters of water.
From Locarnese to Sesto Calende, the people living on the shores once again have soaking feet. Extensive discomfort and damages. The bill once again is steep.
The 2000 flood cost around 125 million Swiss francs for the buildings and contents, and another 30 million for damages due to interrupted business activities and damage to motor vehicles.
The insurance companies are worried. In '93, they already had to cover flood damage to the tune of millions. High figures which we can easily double if we add the bills paid by individuals, municipalities, cantons and confederations. That means us.
Going underwater costs, and if it happens often, it could even lead insurers to raise the insurance premiums for natural damage in the areas at risk. Until now, in order to honour their commitments, the insurance companies have covered each another in a pool.
The pool is an association of private insurers who united long ago in 1953 to support each other, meet the population's needs and guarantee insurance against these natural disasters. As for the premiums, there is one unitary premium for all of Switzerland, rather than a premium which corresponds to the risk for which one would effectively be covered.
People who are flooded regularly can count on the solidarity of all the other policyholders. They pay the same premium as those that remain on dry land because the insurance companies, associated against natural disaster, help each other to adjust the damages.
But for how long will this double solidarity work? And for how long will the public authorities be able to find the millions to pay their part? The flooding of Verbano is not new news. From the 1800s, when the water level began being measured and reliable statistics were written down, it is easy to see a series of flood events that are more or less extreme.
It is, however, alarming to note how in the last 50 years the frequency of the floods has increased. The surveys speak clearly. In the future, with climate change playing its part, such events could occur almost every year.
There are changes occurring, probably due to the greenhouse effect, which tend towards greater climatic extremes, which we perceive as prolonged periods of drought and prolonged periods of precipitation.
Never-ending torrents of rain that cause the lake to overflow, or blue skies that dry out the river basin, forcing it to languish slyly. Unstable levels, sometimes even somewhat out of season.
Too much or too little. And it is not only the floods that have a cost. The prolonged dry spells also have a cost because they hold up navigation, threaten the solidity of the riverbanks and the lake biotopes, and they are disliked by tourists who dream of a postcard lake that they can send home in a photo.
According to the models and the actual trends, one can expect a worsening of the phenomenon, and so a higher frequency of flood events in the future.
Recently, with the way the climate is playing up, the layout and morphology of the Verbano region, which is sheltered by the Alps, does nothing but complicate the situation. The lake's river basin, the whole area that pours water into the lake, is extremely vast.
Almost 6,600 square kilometers, divided in halves between Italy and Switzerland, formed by mountains and valleys that are covered with streams, torrents and rivers which run towards the plain. Even the waters of the Ceresio, Lake Orta and the Varese sooner or later end up flowing into Verbano, which, for this reason, many call Lake Maggiore.
At this point, it is not difficult to understand why, when it continues to rain a lot over Verbano's river basin, the enormous quantity of water that flows towards the lowest point of the whole territory, which is the lake, 4/5 of which extends into Italy, causes the deluges and disasters which by now we all know.
It is not a new phenomenon. It is strictly linked to the geological formation of the whole region and the climatic evolution that has taken place over several eras. And the one that is currently underway does not promise anything good. Precipitation often causes Lake Maggiore's tributaries to swell, and there are lots of them that run quickly down to the plains, favoured by the elevated slopes of the whole territory, from the maximum altitude of 4,633 metres to 193 metres above sea level, a steep river basin, situated at an average of 1,270 metres, which one might think is made on purpose, just to channel up to a peak of 9,000 cubic metres of water per second into the lake.
6,600 kilometers squared of rainwater that from Mount Rosa along the Alpine Arch as far as the southern extreme of Varese inevitably end up in Verbano.
And so the lake rises slowly because it has a surface of about 211 square kilometers, but it rises centimeter after centimeter. It is interesting to note that the 2000 flood was not exceptional just because it exceeded the height of 197 meters and 50 centimeters, almost 5 meters more than its normal level, but also because it was fed for the most part by one single tributary.
On that occasion, the Torce did almost everything on its own. It poured a quantity of water equal to the volume of a 6-story building into the lake every second.
Inflow peaks of 6,000 cubic meters a second for 60 seconds a minute, multiplied again by 60 minutes every hour. An impressive amount of water. In 2000, the inflow to the lake reached 380 million cubic meters a day.
Lake floods are less disastrous than river floods. At least they give the people who live around the lake time to save what they can and escape. But when the high water invades the houses, it comes with a sinister, threatening feeling. All the fault of nature which rages against the human race? Or is she simply reclaiming what we have taken away?
The second question seems the more obvious. We humans often have a short memory. Nature does not. Just to give an example, one of the many possible examples from the banks of Verbano, let's go and see what happened at Locarno at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of last century. The Locarnesi of the time wanted to extend their boundaries on the Maggiore Delta, creating the new quarter. Until that time, the old city had stayed strategically placed against the mountain and finished in the Piazza Grande, in front of the lake that was absolutely natural.
Most of the damage and discomfort caused by today's floods are to be attributed to the short memory of people who went and constructed right on the lake. And there's nothing to be surprised about if Verbano, when it floods, tends to expand right in that spot. It takes back territory that belonged to it before the Locarnesi constructed the new quarter.
Recently, to defend themselves from high water, there were even those that wanted to Hollandize the low part of the city, a retractable dam along the shoreline, made of mobile floodgates that would be raised only when needed, just enough to hold the waters up to a height of 198 meters.
And if the lake reached a higher level, as has already happened in the past? Or if one of the floodgates did not rise? Goodbye new quarter. The flood wave would sweep everything away, people and houses included. The idea has the defect of trying to oppose the forces of nature with a very local intervention.
Even when people intervene to change the watercourses in the catchments, which are seemingly very far from the lake, we tend to solve the problem from a very local perspective. Straighten watercourses, channel them between artificial embankments, without worrying too much whether doing so might increase the quantity and velocity of the water running downstream.
Let's look at another example. Among the numerous possibilities, let's go to Val Vigezzo, a mountain region that only seems to be far from the lake. To avoid damage from flooding streams and torrents to the inhabited part of the village, the Druogno municipality rightly tried to propose a remedy.
This is a completely artificial watercourse, because following the floods of 78, the banks were unstable and there was a lot of erosion. So it was necessary to construct vertical structures, embankments to protect the riverbanks, and also structures to protect the river bottom to guarantee greater water velocity and therefore higher flows. All of this to defend the village immediately downstream. In this watercourse, a longitudinal defence structure was built. These are the structures that we can see on the bottom, made of massive walls, and constructed to defend the houses and the banks themselves from erosion. Here, the riverbed was not modified because it is big enough to guarantee the outflow of water.
Walls to consolidate the embankments, often cement also on the bottom to favour the water flow. All traditional hydraulic engineering solutions, useful for solving local problems, less useful if we take into account the effects that they can produce downstream.
Basically, the interventions that are carried out upstream are in function of local needs. So unfortunately, local problems are solved without thinking about the consequences that these interventions can have on the villages, the torrents and the lake, which are downstream. One could think about intervening with alternative methodologies instead, such as those used in naturalistic engineering, which use materials other than normal cement. The mountain territory could be used as an expansion tank, using it to hold the water back as much as possible, seeing as it is also much less densely populated and can therefore be used in this way.
Interventions and urban plans certainly must be reviewed, but what can we do to improve the situation right away? If Verbano floods because it receives too much water, wouldn't it be sufficient just to dredge the lake outlet to allow the Ticino to flow out more quickly at Sesto Calende?
It seems like the golden egg, a lot of incoming water and just as much flowing out. It is one of the hypotheses taken into consideration in the Verbano Project by the researchers from Politecnico di Milano Technical University, who were engaged to study the problem within the research program INTERREG II, promoted by the European Union.
The hypothesis of excavating the lake outlet might be advantageous to the lakeside inhabitants, but it could provoke serious damages for the inhabitants and the economic activities that are carried out downstream. Because if the wave that comes out of Lake Maggiore during a flood event was synchronized with the one that comes down from Torino along the Po, it could result not only in serious flooding at Pavia, but also extensive damages in the delta of the Po's river.
In October 2000, Pavia went underwater too. The flood in the Pavese and along the Polesine was not as disastrous as the flood of 51, even if the level of the Ticino at Pavia greatly exceeded the height reached in the previous flood.
The effects of high water at Verbano unfortunately reverberate here as well, because it should not be forgotten that after Pavia, the Ticino flows into the Po. And if in October 2000 the flood wave that came down from Lake Maggiore had met the flood wave in the Po, the disaster images would have been even more dramatic than these. The complexity of the problem is right here. Try to regulate the levels of the lake to prevent it from flooding as much as possible without compromising the security of everything downstream, along the Ticino and consequently along the Po after Pavia. A difficult challenge, but the Verbano Project team decided to take it on.
The evaluation of complex projects of this type historically has always been carried out by a group of stakeholders who commission a project planner. The planner elaborated within the confines of his office, evaluated with his criteria, and in the end came up with his proposal. Obviously, this proposal was then presented to the other interested parties, but they often had the feeling that the proposal and the evaluations were invalidated from the outset because only one side's interests were accounted for. For example, in our case, the downstream inhabitants certainly fear that the proposal comes from the lakeside dwellers' interest in diminishing the floods.
Because the waters of Verbano do not only represent a threat. On the contrary, they have always been a source of wealth, both for the inhabitants of the lake and for the downstream population. For the latter, the lake has always been an important water reserve that is very useful for agriculture and industry. The first studies to attempt to regulate the lake levels to have sufficient water even during dry spells date back to the end of the 1800s.
We have to wait until the 20th century, however, to see them put to practice, when, at the beginning of the 40s, part of the mouth of the lake at Sesto Calende was excavated, and a few kilometers downstream, the Miorina Dam was constructed, a regulation system that allows water to be held in the lake or left to flow downstream according to what is needed. A relatively simple but efficient installation which still functions.
The regulation system at Miorina entered into service on the 1st of January in 1943, and it is made of 120 barriers exactly like this model, which can be moved using these controls. Each of the barriers can be moved into 4 water retention positions, plus a position in which the barrier is completely lowered, and the entire dam is then open as it is at the moment.
In 1943, the construction of this structure concluded an international agreement between Italy and Switzerland concerning the management of the levels of Lake Maggiore.
At that time, the farmers and industries from the valley asked to be able to keep up to 1.5 meters of water in the lake over the whole year. They were granted this, however, only during dry periods. In spring and autumn, when there is abundant rain, only 1 meter was allowed. The floods have always frightened the lakeside inhabitants.
The surveys that have been carried out over the years have shown that the agreement that was stipulated in 1943, contrary to what is commonly believed, allowed the downstream needs to be met and also reduced the flooding of the lake. The reduction of the flooding was most efficient for small and medium events, because for the big events that last for longer, the Miorina Dam can do very little.
This is why it seemed reasonable also to the researchers from Milan to begin with another excavation of the lake's mouth at Sesto Calende, to diminish flooding upstream and guarantee better flows downstream.
The way in which we elaborated this project, which is the way that from now on all projects will be elaborated, involved all of the interested parties from the beginning of its development. The biggest economic interests connected with irrigation, the production of electricity and the floods, but also interests that in a certain sense might seem more modest, such as those of the lake fishermen, tourist businesses, or the problem of the proliferation of mosquitoes and all of the environmental aspects, from the reproduction of fish to the fauna in the Bolle di Magadino.
Maybe this is the real innovation and the strong point of the method adopted to deal with the complexity of the problem. Involve all of the stakeholders from the very beginning. All of the sectors that benefit from the lake's water, both upstream and downstream. Because, let's remember, the word water does not mean just flooding and deluge.
In medieval times, the Dukedom of Milano based its riches on a network of canals used for transport and agriculture. It is documented that in 1500 the gross net product of the dukedom was 6 times that of the Crown of England, thanks to a very advanced system of water exploitation.
Still today, the production of rice, which is cultivated in irrigated areas, also using water from the lake, represents more than 90% of Italy's production, a business worth millions of euros.
Noi siamo stati coinvolti sin dall'inizio e questo
We were involved from the beginning, and this allowed us to assess a new way to tackle the problem of regulating the waters of Lake Maggiore. As is well known, is the source of many years of conflict between upstream and downstream communities. But we have also seen that by analyzing things in greater detail than has always been done in the past, acceptable solutions were found, even if at first they did not seem to be.
Agriculture is not the only sector interested in Verbano's water. Industry also draws water from the lake for its own needs. Along the Ticino effluent, 5 power plants produce electrical energy.
Clean energy, which does not pollute, like the energy produced by thermoelectric plants that are responsible for feeding the greenhouse effect with their chimneys. And these days, when we say greenhouse, our thoughts rush to the way the climate is playing up.
The turbines at the Vizzola Ticino plant, already functioning at the end of 1800, were the first in Europe to provide energy for a big city's public transport, the Milanese trams.
I would say that from my point of view it was very interesting, even technically, to participate in this type of experience. It was the first time for me and the others that we evaluated and witnessed the application of a method to solve complex problems. I think that these methods are logical and important. This also allowed us to understand the positions of the others in detail and to debate with them about the possible hypotheses for better management of the lake levels.
Let's move upstream to look at another example. Among the stakeholders in this problem are those concerned with the Bolle di Magadino, a protected wetlands of international importance, situated at the mouth of the Ticino.
It is clear that raising or lowering the average level of the lake could compromise the equilibrium of the entire biotope, mortgaging the very future of this wetland.
So the Bolle di Magadino Foundation was involved in the project, together with the river parks of the Ticino and the associations of fishermen, to identify the indicators that could describe and measure the effects of the lake levels on the marshland ecosystem.
When they asked us to become involved in the INTERREG II project, we identified 6 or 7 indicators that can testify to the greater or lesser utility that these alternatives can have on the ecosystem.
In this same fashion, collaborating with all of the interested parties, both upstream and downstream, the first phase of research singled out and defined about 70 indicators, able to describe all of the effects produced by the levels and outflows of the lake.
With the indicators and mathematical models, the utility index was evaluated, which is the degree of satisfaction that each stakeholder could expect from each alternative.
Once this would not have been possible. For example, Meraviglia and Varese, when they designed the current situation for the lake, they did the calculations by hand. Therefore, they could only examine the effect that the regulation of the lake would have had over one single year, 1883 to 1884, which is shown here. Today, we can estimate the effect that the project would have over an entire 25-year period, thus seeing much greater phenomena, and taking into consideration not only the lake level and the flow released, but all of the people that we identified as stakeholders. Therefore, today it's possible to create a very detailed model and take into account all the various points of view.
The alternatives that were examined take into consideration not only the excavation of the mouth of the lake, but also the creation of an information system to regulate the levels that accounts for the satisfaction of upstream interests as well as those downstream.
But how much should one or the other be satisfied? A compromise had to be found.
In order to find consensus, All of the interested parties must know each other's problems and understand why any given situation might cause advantages and disadvantages. It's only through knowing what others have and what others suffer that one can objectively attempt to evaluate the most equitable compromise between what I have and what you have.
In the second phase of the study, the researchers from Milano Politecnico called all of the stakeholders to meet around a table and asked them to single out, from among all of the alternatives, the one that they preferred, or at least those that won the greatest consensus.
Proceeding in this way, from a total of about 200 different alternatives, we singled out 9 which arouse interest from different people. Among these, there is a particularly interesting one, the one that we call A34, for which the consensus is very broad.
But what does A34 foresee?
The excavation of the mouth of the lake at Sesto Calende to empty it more quickly during the floods compared with what happens today. The increase in the maximum capacity of the lake up to 1.50 meters for the whole year. And a decision support system to manage the release from the lake into the Ticino on a daily basis.
Alternative A34 shows that upstream it is possible to reduce the floods. Several floods in the last 25 years would never have occurred, while the exceptional events, like the 2000 flood, would have been more contained.
For the downstream users, the increase in the maximum capacity of the lake foreseen in this alternative would provide much more water in the periods of drought than that available today. A34 does not satisfy everyone, however. The Bolle di Magadino, the river parks of the Ticino, and the city of Pavia believe they could be disadvantaged by this alternative.
It's easy to see that if the average level of the lake is raised, the wetlands will often be underwater.
From this point of view, one can see the aquatic reed beds very well. The effect of the water levels, especially when they are high, is twofold depending on the season. In the winter period, for example, if the water is too high, we have a problem of erosion and a lack of regeneration of the reed beds towards the lake. In the springtime, in the nesting period, water levels that are too high provoke the submersion of the nest and the destruction of the hatch. One of the possibilities for mitigating this important disadvantage, which would result from average levels that are higher than those today, would be to expand the marshland zone towards the mainland, and so give the marshland the possibility to readapt slowly to the new levels. But this clearly creates a conflict with the agricultural zones behind, which currently delimit quite cleanly the border between marshland and the zone used by the human population.
Even if the acquisition of agricultural lands to mitigate the impact of A34 on the Bolle di Magadino seems relatively easy to achieve, much further downstream, the solutions for mitigating the effect on the city of Pavia are more complicated.
The excavation of the mouth of the lake would in fact produce an increase in the flow of the Ticino at Pavia, a small increase, but one which, during a flood, could be very dangerous.
In a situation in which the Po is low, even a flood of large dimensions can drain away without creating any problems, unlike even a medium-sized flood in a situation in which the Po is high, which can cause problems for Pavia because we're in an overflow zone for the waters that tend to rise rapidly until they reach the city. We can remember the last flood of 2000, in which the volumes involved were considerable, and it managed even to exceed the height of the historic flood of 1951. If I remember correctly, the runoff volumes from the Ticino were around 5,000 cubic meters a second, which is certainly a great volume of water in motion.
The Ticino flows into the Po 17 kilometers downstream under the bridge of the Becca. The biggest problems occur when the flood waves of the two rivers are synchronized. Encountering the rush of the Po, the waters of the Ticino cannot find an outlet, return upstream and submerge the city.
For Pavia, we can think about regulating the lake not just in function of the level of the lake itself, but also of the flows that are running in the Po, in order to hold water in the lake when a release would be dangerous for Pavia.
But to regulate the lake also in flood conditions, it will be necessary to modify the Miorina barriers to allow them to be maneuvered at any given moment.
Obviously, this alternative encounters some difficulties. Psychological difficulties from the lakeside inhabitants upstream, who fear that with its implementation the floods might get bigger. One must demonstrate that instead the floods will be smaller, markedly smaller compared to the past.
The calculations showed that by regulating the lake even during the flood, in 2000 the flows to Pavia would have been diminished by 400 cubic meters per second, while the level of the lake would have been 70 centimeters lower just the same.
With these mitigations, A34 satisfies almost everyone. A good result. But is it possible to do better?
What we studied is a planning aspect, which is a decision made today for tomorrow. But if this project were to be implemented and the lake was excavated, and at a particular time the regulator had to make a decision, he or she would have information that today we don't have. The information will be that which is happening. He or she would be able to know about the atmospheric disturbances over Europe, have information about how much snow there is in the mountains at that moment, and all of this information, put into a decision system, allow him or her to make decisions that are more agile, more rapid and more prompt.
Speed, decisional efficiency, that will not completely eliminate exceptional floods, but that will permit, as the Verbano Project has demonstrated, a considerable reduction.
This study is an important first step in the right direction. The previous studies that we have were very sectoral. They only took into consideration the interests of one or another. They put the accent on the expectations of the lakeside inhabitants, who for some time have wanted to empty it quickly in a flood event, without taking account of the needs of the people downstream, who consider the lake principally as a reserve of water. This study managed to involve the upstream and downstream environments in the search for a common objective.
How much time will the Verbano Project have to spend in the wings before taking centre stage on the political scene? Because the problem is transboundary, now it is the Italo-Swiss Commission's turn to evaluate the results and promote or develop further one of the alternatives proposed by the study.
As for the costs of carrying out one of these alternatives, it is too early for an estimate. But one thing is certain. It would cost much less than the flood damages that the future seems to be promising. Because finishing up often with soaking feet costs, and it certainly is no good for our health.